Hello, all participants to this self-learning module 1, whose topic is the emergency response and actions to undertake to be effective in management. Emergency response refers to a set of coordinated actions taken to manage and mitigate impacts of potentially disastrous events that may happen. How disastrous an event can be, it depends on the event itself, how intense and frequent it is, but also on the weakness that we and the assets that we care about have. That means the vulnerability. And the effectiveness of our response depend on how well prepared we are to confront with an emergency, which is coming up. Understanding the underlying risk of the locale then implies the knowledge of 3 elements: the livelihood and severity of an expected hazardous event. That means intensity and frequency, return periods. Then to understand our weaknesses, the weaknesses of ourselves and the values we care about, and the nature of the values themselves, how weak they are, and how exposed they are to the risk. And critical in this operation is mapping risk. That means mapping geographically which part of the landscape are more vulnerable than others, and mapping in refer to the value themselves. So what part of the values that we care, monuments, landscape, are potentially impacted. And prevention and mitigations implies 2 types of intervention. Structural, that means engineering intervention in the case of climatic risk, and non-structural intervention, everything that applies to our behavior. Then things to do, having a plan how to behave during emergency, ensure that the plan is effective, and to have an effective way of coordinated communicate among different actors. And moreover, there are nature-based solutions to mitigate the impacts that relates to the capacity of nature to help us in undertaking some positive actions. And all this prevention and mitigation before and response after, they feed back each other, one into the other, of these 2 phases, and they contribute to our increasing preparedness as long as we confront with emergencies. Now, what are the hazards that impact modern Myanmar? So, how do we understand the hazard? Well, we have climatic type of hazard, which means seasonal rain, storms that hit episodically, and eventually cyclones, especially on the windward side of Myanmar. Second major hazard relates to the earthquakes, because the crust of Myanmar is a mobile area, and faults are potentially generating earthquakes, and there have been history of earthquake. And we have conflict among different parts of the society and developmental pressure. Okay, so this is what relates to the hazard. But what can we look in the landscape to understand what's going on, for example, when rain comes, when climatic hardship comes in, and we have to confront with that? Okay, the best things that we can do is just to observe an example of negative, of impacting event, that is the Mocha flood in 2023. This is an image that shows the landscape immediately after the Mocha flood. A it's a satellite image, and it allows us to understand what the rainfall does when it comes onto the landscape. So first of all, we see a diffuse runoff coming down up from upland and draining all the way down to the river. This diffuse runoff eventually concentrates into stream and creeks and rills and contributes to the rivers that are present in the Bagan plain. And so there are three mechanisms where the rainfall comes from the mountain and goes down to the river. Okay, when intensive rain comes, the rainfall is feeding through the rivers, is feeding into the lake, so it's filling the lakes, but at the same time is recharging the groundwater. What does it mean? It means that the rainwater filters down to the ground, and it supports the aquifer, supports the groundwater. This is important, and we'll see later in the second module why this groundwater is important. For now, it's sufficient for us to understand that this groundwater that is going down inside the soil in the upper land, it filters out at some stage, and it contributes severely to the flood. And what we see in red here is actually the distribution of the flood during the Mocha flood, during the Mocha cyclone. What happens during this event in 2023 is that large part of the monumental area of Bagan has been flooded, partly by rainfall and waterlogging, partly by river feeding into, and partly by the groundwater that is seeping out of the ground, and it's impacting the monumental area. The result is lake overflow. Many of the lake have overflown. We have waterlogging in some of the landscape depressions, and we have also flooding, inundation of the temple precinct. And on top of that, in green, we have the map of the ground saturation. Ground saturation means that the particles of the soil are filled with water, and this water comes out and makes the soil weak and foundation more unstable. Why this happens and why the Bagan territory is vulnerable to this flood, we can understand this if we look at the topography. And topography tells us that Bagan is subdivided in two parts. One is a sloping ground from the mountain that is well drained, so the water flows freely down the slope, and it doesn't produce any flood. But when the water comes down the slope and meets what is the old Bagan terrace, then it's the time when this water sits on the ground and cause the inundation. And why this happens, we can understand it from this cross-section. We see that the eastern part is a sloping area which is well drained, and the western part of the Bagan plain is a flatland, and the flatland is where the flood comes. So this is the reason why the vulnerability of the monumental area is strictly related to the morphology of the landscape. So that's where we have to focus on our attention. So this is an analysis of the landscape and an attempt to understand vulnerability, because once we understand the vulnerability, then we we can take appropriate actions to resolve and to minimize, to mitigate the impacts. Okay, this is a geomorphological interpretation of Bagan. We have this fan shape, yellow-colored terrace, which is made of conglomerates that were brought down from the mountain by the rivers. And we see in the red spots all the area that has been flooded during this disastrous event last year in 2023. So this is actually the analysis that we can undertake to understand the vulnerability of the area and the potential risk that our values, in this case the monuments, are facing during the rainfall, during the seasonal rainfall, and during occasionally during cyclones. So this ends the first part of the module, and we will see what to do to respond to this impact in the second self-learning module. And now we can come to some conclusions to prepare for an effective emergency response. And so the first thing is to understand factors that contribute to risk, namely the nature and likelihood of the hazardous event, return periods, expected intensity, seasonality. Then we have to consider the vulnerability of the exposed assets and the landscape, which is also an asset. We have to identify vulnerability hotspots that deserve more effective attention. And these aspects are critical to perform a systematic approach to risk mitigation. Then we have to understand the processes that shape the landscape, because once we understand this, then we can more effectively adopt some measures. And so it's very important to understand the concept of erosion, the positional pattern, landscape morphology, but more groundwater distribution, soil wetness. There are all kinds of physical indicators in the landscape that are useful to plan the interventions. For example, the origin of landforms, whether they are natural or human-made, or if they are natural and modified, how they were modified, and how this modification implied more problem. And this knowledge of the physical processes helps to guide the planning and the design of interventions. And last, we have some aspects that that need to be taken care into the planning. That is routine maintenance of the landscape, which is a seasonal or frequent fixing of some flaws in the landscape, but we can have also one-time projects, and we can have emergency intervention that are more specifically designed to cope with these impactive events. And then we have to perform, based on our knowledge, we have to perform landscape monitoring and diagnostics. In brief, we have to understand what are landscape failures based on some indicators, and based on this understanding, we have to propose some solutions to fix it. So landscape failure are important, and we will see them in the next self-learning module. Emergency response planning is a critical element of the emergency response, because it implies to have a design of what our actions should be in the case of an emergency. Developing the plan is important, implementing, but also adjusting, because no plan are perfect at the beginning, but based on our experience, our lessons learned, then we can adapt our plan more and more to the needs of the landscape to reach a satisfactory way to respond to emergency.